Similarities between family divorces and business divorces, part of the series Bankruptcy Mediation with Sylvia Mayer. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcast. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact dependent. Hey everyone, this is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, arbitrator, working throughout Florida and Texas.
Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from England.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sylvia Mayer. I'm an arbitrator, mediator, and attorney located in Houston, Texas. Thanks for having me.
All right. Good to see you again, Sylvia. So this conversation is going to be a comparison kind of game between family type of mediations, like family divorce cases, versus uh, business or commercial uh, divorces or commercial mediations. So a lot of times, okay, first off, everyone knows what a divorce case is, right? Between two individuals, man, woman get married, husband, wife, yada yada, and they have a kid. They go through a divorce, and then usually the court's going to be involved with making decisions about the party's property and the party's children. And when we say children, we talk about, well, what's going to happen with regards to schedules, child support, and all that stuff. This is stuff that Natalia and I deal with all the time as family law attorneys. Now, in the same way, Sylvia, you deal with this in a different way where the parties are not necessarily spouses, and they don't necessarily have children, but they go through a type of divorce or a type of separation. And a lot of times it's when they have a piece of property in common. It might not be a child, but it's their baby, so to speak. Okay. So what we wanted to do today was contrast these two types of divorces and show that there's plenty of similarities. And it will be a fun, kind of chat because I'm curious, Sylvia, how you see it from your perspective, as it similarly to the way Natalia and I see it when it comes to divorces in the family courts. But with that, I guess I could bring up a traditional way of seeing things from my perspective, and then Sylvia, if you wanted to kind of give it to us from the business side, it would be great. So when you're handling a divorce case, you typically have to deal with children's issues. Okay, there's that common child, and so both parents see that child as, in a way, their property, right? They belong, that child, he or she belongs to them. And it it's hard sometimes to trust that the other parent is going to have that child's best interest at heart. And so that is a theme you see running over and over and over again in custody battles in the middle of a divorce case. And so, Sylvia, how is it on your end? Or do you have, I guess, custody battles, so to speak, over property in a commercial dispute?
Absolutely. So, business divorces come up in a couple of ways. One, the business has failed, and all that's left to divide up are the liabilities or the assets. Or two, somebody has committed or is believed to have committed fraud or some other form of deception. Or sometimes three, where there's a disagreement about what the future of the business should be. So, if you think of those three sort of broad categories, it's typically a small business where two or more people have created that business, built it from the ground up. They own it. They're the sole owners. And this business in their minds and their hearts are their baby. And so it's the same kind of fight in terms of a custody battle where neither one believes the other can care for the baby as well as they could. So if it's a situation where the business failed and all we're dividing up is the liabilities and what remaining assets there may be, then that's less of a factor. There's a lot of emotions, but that's less of a factor because there's not really much baby left. But if it's a situation where one or both parties believes the other has committed fraud or some malfeasance, or where they have divergent views on the future of the business, then it really is very similar to a custody battle because each of them wants to be the one to decide how we're going to raise this baby. How does this baby, how is my child going to go from here to its next step? And so there's a lot of similarities in that in terms of what they're fighting over.
And moreover, there might be an intersection of it. I personally had a mediation where we had spouses having a business together. And the business was a restaurant. And originally they divided the way they were running the business and shared some responsibilities. When they marriage started to have problems, the cooperation within business was also very difficult between them. And to my greatest surprise, it evolved from a commercial dispute because I was representing the man, and then we went to a mediation, me as a attorney representing a client, because of the fact of what happened, actually not in the marriage, but in the business. But we ended up talking about communication within the marriage. And fortunately, because these people, because of their other commitments, because of how long they've been together, they didn't want to divorce, but they wanted to have the business, who was actually, which was their baby and was quite successful, to continue to grow and not to be affected by their personal discord. Therefore, we really reached an agreement about, for example, the hours where each of them could be staying within the premises of this restaurant. So that was aiming at avoiding the tensions between the two of them, and this being also seen by the employees of the restaurant or the clients. And actually, I need to tell you that it was some time ago and it went well. I sometimes go to this restaurant and it continues to be operational until this day. And I just wanted to share that because that also shows that mediation can be a way of moving forward and not just dissolving things and problems that may appear.
Yeah, Sylvia, what about debts when with regards to the same baby, so to speak, like liabilities? How do you, or in your experience, how have you dealt with uh, I guess, resolving disputes over debts and liabilities? Because in the divorce world, in the traditional family divorce world, we deal with dividing assets and dividing liabilities all the time. How do you contrast it? What are the similarities to yours?
Well, so I'm going to guess that one of the primary similarities between this issue in a business divorce versus a family divorce is the high emotion level. Because it is very common in this situation that one side feels betrayed or deceived by the other. And that factors into their views on how the assets and liabilities should be divided. And I think the example of the family restaurant is a perfect example because you have a situation where you have this incredibly valuable asset, but it also has liabilities, and you have to find the path forward in order to help manage, divide, or preserve those assets and liabilities. So the way I see it work a lot of times in business divorce mediations is that you have to work through the emotions before you can really get to the underlying issue, the substantive legal issue of who's taking what and who's bearing which liability. And until you have gotten through the emotions and in the example given, the communication, you're not going to really make progress. And so you're dealing with, you may be having offers going back and forth, but what you're really dealing with are the emotions during that stage of the mediation.
Yeah, Sylvia, how do you deal with emotions then? Because you're not a like a psychotherapist, psychologist, or even like a marriage counselor in this regard, right? So,
Right.
how do you get folks together who might feel betrayed and might have zero trust, but now they have this common baby, together? How do you deal with it?
So I often say to people that I use the ABCs of mediation, meaning that I, as the mediator, I am analytical, I am a bartender, and I am a chameleon. And so that means that as bartender, a lot of times what people most need is just an empathetic ear. And I have had cases where business divorces and other types of mediations, where what they most needed was somebody just to listen empathically, validate their feelings, validate their emotions. Sometimes they need you to listen more than once. I've had cases where they needed to tell me their story 3 or 4 or 5 times before they were ready to move on. So that bartender skill is critically important here and in others, but in business divorces, it's really critical because there's a lot of emotions that come into it. Being analytical, I'm always trying to read the lawyers and the parties and try to see what their need is. Sometimes a party needs me to walk them through the law. Sometimes they need me to validate what they're feeling. Sometimes they need me to ask them questions that help open up their mind to other possibilities. So I'm always trying to watch and try to read what's going on. What's the way to help them move to the next step? And then chameleon refers to the fact that I may have to change, right? They may come into the mediation and they need me to be bartender. But then after I've been bartender once or twice, what they really need is for me to put my analytical hat on and start poking holes, start asking them more probing questions. Or maybe what they need is for me to open their eyes to the opportunities of closure and using their imagination to think about what would this be like when it's behind you? How can we divide these things up so you can move forward in your life? And so it's the ABCs of being a mediator.
And having said that, I was also thinking, one of the things that we do during the family mediation is the caucus mediation, meaning we separate the parties because of high emotions, because of the necessity to discuss certain issues. Do you also use this technique, Sylvia, in the business divorces? Do you really use caucus mediation that much?
Absolutely. And, I think joint sessions versus caucus mediations are also regional. And so I think, I try to talk to the attorneys for each side before we get to mediation and understand if they feel a joint session would be worthwhile. It is my experience that the vast majority of parties, business divorce, bankruptcy, mediation, whatever the subject is, the vast majority of them just want caucus style. And I, whether that's the right or wrong answer, I don't know. I will say that there have been some business divorce mediations that I've handled where once we worked through the emotions, once we got to the point where everybody was ready to roll up their sleeves and start talking real meaningful numbers and deal points, that sometimes that's a moment where bringing them together is helpful because you can tap into they built it together and now they're going to figure out the closure together. It doesn't work in every case, but there are some situations where once they're ready emotionally and intellectually, coming together to do that closure is an important part of the process.
Yeah, Sylvia. So once you've gotten these folks to reach a conclusion, reach closure, and let's say they decide to, in the example of the restaurant that was given earlier, they decide to keep the business afloat um, in a different way. Okay, maybe restructure it in a different way. How do you, I guess, make sure that they're going to be good co-parents, so to speak, now that they're not together anymore? Because I can imagine folks who have their emotions entwined because they were lovers or they were spouses, and there's heart issues there, might not be so good to work together in the future, right? So how do you help ensure that?
So, it's really interesting. If they're going to continue on the path together, then you're talking about deal points that are above and beyond just somebody pushing some money across the table one way or the other, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to bake into the discussion, what are the guardrails? What are the protections we're going to have here to make sure that everybody's moving in the same direction? And that's a really critically important conversation to have. I would think that the corollary in a family context is some kind of co-parenting training or something like that, where you're learning skills on how you focus on the child and not whatever stuff you have going on yourself. The same comes up in a business divorce. What are the guardrails? What are the metrics that we can use that establish who does what? And I also find that in those situations where the parties have worked out something where they're going to continue forward together, parenting the baby, the business, so the business is going to survive and they're both going to stay involved, that there has to be some kind of rebuilding of the trust between the parties. And that may be a difference between family law mediation and business divorces. But they have to have some way to rebuild that trust and that connection in order for them to stay in business together.
And this is what I wanted to interrupt you with, because this is actually what I've been thinking of when people are to continue in business. When the trust is already, let's say very, very little between the parties, there can be safety measures, like, for example, signing the papers, so authorizing the transfers or together, so that there is we're minimizing the risk of someone actually taking advantage of the business for their own purposes. So I do believe that, like, signing of important papers, then employing personnel, that's again a way that you can have someone who then being employed might generate high costs that can be difficult to bear for the business. So there is like particular categories where I've been introducing moments where the partners were having a joint decision power. So that was clear that one unilaterally can't act against the other, or if they do, they are being held accountable for that. What's your experience on that?
I'd say it's the exact same thing. Is you have to have it, that's what I refer to as guardrails. You have to have some kind of process that says, here's where we have to make joint decisions, and these are the parameters around that. And here's what happens if we can't decide. What do we do if we can't make a decision? And sometimes what you'll see is that they establish metrics and the performance, it may be performance metrics, financial performance metrics. And the conclusion is, if X metric isn't met, then Y is the result. And so maybe they have decided they're going to repurpose the business to focus in a different direction. And if that doesn't work, then that's going to be the end. And here is the exit strategy if they get there. So a business divorce mediation can be a far more complex conversation. It's more transactional than a lot of other mediations if the business is going to survive. And sometimes what I'll see is in a business divorce situation, one person is going to continue on with the business and the other person is going to depart. And what you're really negotiating is what they get to leave, right? What are you going to pay them to go away? And is that going to be paid now in a lump sum, or is that going to be paid over time? Are they going to hold an equity interest in the business? So you have all of these different things. And it sounds very similar to the example you're giving around the restaurant, is you really have to think through, what does this partnership look like? What are the protections we can put in for each side? What are the rules that we establish that help protect you as you're moving down the road? And what's the consequence if someone goes out of bounds? What happens then?
Yeah, Sylvia, we're running out of time, but I was gonna ask you this question, and you just kind of answered it. And that question was, which one do you see more often? The situation where the parties agree to decide to stay together, so to speak, to co-parent this baby that they had started together some years before, or the situation where one person departs and one person remains as, I guess, the sole owner. Because in the true family context, the most common result is both have to stay and learn how to co-parent, right? There's a few times a parent might literally terminate their own rights or have their rights terminated because they were a danger to the child. But in your world, I'm guessing it's the opposite, right? That one person stays, one person goes.
Absolutely. So this is one of the differences. So while both in family divorces and business divorces, we're dealing with high emotions, oftentimes feelings of betrayal and deception and dividing up assets and liabilities and this incredible baby that everybody's so passionate about, whether the baby is a business or actually a child. One of the big differences, I think, is in family law, there has to be some level of co-parenting going forward. In a business divorce, there doesn't have to be that. That is not the default. And so I would say that, if I remember, I said that some business divorces are businesses that have already failed. So put those aside. Of those where the business has not already failed, either they're arguing over the future of the business or there has been some either actual or perceived malfeasance, I would say maybe 20% are people who decide they're going to stay together actively operating. I'd probably add another 20% where someone is going to get paid whatever they're going to get paid over time. So they will have some access and visibility as they'll continue to have an investment, but they will no longer actually be in charge or really engaged on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you.
And again, having said that, I also want to think about this sort of mediation, just like in family mediation and in the business divorces, about the mediator being skilled enough to let parties open up their eyes to see the value in the other partner, in what they were bringing, what they are bringing. If we are to remain with the child, we need to also learn anew to see this value. That's really giving me hope in all the family mediations, but also in the business divorces mediations. And I really, with this hope, also the color of hope on me is green for those who are listening. I want to close up and thank Sylvia so much for sharing your precious experience and all these remarks. And until the next time.
All right, guys.